Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so today we're going deep on something you probably think you know the basics of, at least. Little Rock.
Yeah, it's one of those stories everyone's heard of.
Right. I mean, we all remember those images of the Little Rock Nine, right? 9 brave black students facing those angry mobs just to integrate Central High School back in '57. But the thing is, the impact of Little Rock goes way beyond just that one school, that one year.
Yeah, it really exposed how different things were on the ground compared to what the law said.
It's like, okay, the laws are changing, but is society keeping up?
Exactly.
And, it made me think about Brown v. Board of Education. Huge, right? That was 1954 when the Supreme Court basically said, separate but equal, nope, not constitutional. But then just 3 years later, you get Little Rock. It really tested just how serious everyone was about actually desegregating.
And the resistance was strong. You can't talk about Little Rock without talking about Governor Orval Faubus of Arkansas. He used that whole crisis to become like the face of segregationist resistance. And he was pretty successful at it politically, too.
Oh, yeah. The guy was elected governor 4 times.
4 times.
Mm-hmm.
4 times. It shows you how deeply ingrained segregation was in certain parts of the country. And Faubus didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. In 1958, he actually shut down all the high schools in Little Rock for an entire year.
Rather than the lost year. Crazy, right? A whole year of education lost for all those kids.
A whole generation impacted.
Yeah.
And it sent a message. Southern leaders were serious about maintaining segregation. They were willing to do whatever it took.
So where was Eisenhower in all this? I mean, he's the president, right? But turns out he wasn't so quick to really push for desegregation at first.
It was a complex situation. He had to uphold the law of the land on one hand. But on the other hand, he had to navigate these deep political divisions in the country. And remember, this wasn't just an abstract legal debate anymore. It involved real children, the Little Rock Nine, facing danger every day just to go to school.
And this is where I think it gets really interesting. Little Rock became this national flashpoint. And one of the big reasons for that was television. This was still kind of the early days of TV.
And Little Rock was one of the first civil rights events to get major live coverage. Can you imagine seeing that in your living room? Watching these young black students being harassed, threatened, and not by other kids, but by grown adults.
Like early reality TV, but with stakes that were unbelievably high.
And it had a huge impact on public opinion, especially in the North. Because suddenly, this wasn't some far-off problem. People were seeing the ugliness of segregation right there in their own homes.
Especially that image of Elizabeth Eckford, that photo of her surrounded by that white mob trying to get to school. It just burned itself into people's minds.
Powerful imagery.
And, it makes you think about how much media shapes our understanding of things. Even today, look at how we consume news now. Little Rock was kind of a turning point for how media could expose injustice and, really galvanize people to want to do something about it.
It definitely had an impact. And speaking of impact, the Supreme Court took notice, too. In 1958, they issued a pretty strong response to all the resistance that was happening, not just in Little Rock, but in other southern states as well, with a decision called Cooper v. Aaron.
This is where Chief Justice Earl Warren lays down the law.
He really does. He said, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Basically saying you can't just ignore federal rulings on desegregation because you don't like them.
Mic drop moment. But here's the thing. Even with the Supreme Court saying this is how it is, the reality on the ground was still very different. Because Cooper v. Aaron was a powerful statement, sure, but it still needed the executive branch to actually enforce it. And maybe even more importantly, it needed public support to really work. Because laws are just words on paper, right? If nobody's actually willing to back them up. And it's around this time that a lot of Black Americans are realizing, hey, winning court cases is great, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
They needed to find ways to force the government to actually follow through on those rulings to make equality a reality. And in a way, Little Rock showed them how to do that.
It kind of became a blueprint for a new kind of activism.
Exactly.
It was like, okay, how do we create a situation that's going to force the federal government to step in? How do we get media attention focused on this? And ultimately, how do we change public opinion?
And this is the model you see again and again in the civil rights movement. The Freedom Rides, Birmingham, the Selma marches.
Activists putting themselves on the line, knowing that things could get dangerous, things could get ugly, but also knowing that by shining a light on the reality of segregation, they could force the nation to confront its conscience and push for change. So Little Rock wasn't just about Desegregating one school, it changed the way the whole civil rights movement operated.
So we've gone from this local issue in Arkansas to something with national, even global implications. But how do historians actually view the legacy of Little Rock? Well, turns out there's no easy answer.
There are a lot of different opinions. In fact, historians have identified at least 4 different schools of thought on this. First, you have the traditionalists. They really focus on President Eisenhower's decision to send in federal troops to enforce desegregation at Central Highs. That's the key takeaway for them. It set a precedent for federal involvement in civil rights, paved the way for future government action.
So it's all about Eisenhower putting his foot down, saying, hey, federal law is federal law.
Exactly. Then you have what's called the continuity school of thought. They see Little Rock as part of this much longer struggle for racial justice in America, building on decades of activism, legal battles.
So Little Rock was important, sure, but it wasn't necessarily the turning point, more like another step in this long journey.
Right. Part of this ongoing fight for equality goes back generations. Then there are the legalists. They emphasize the limits of legal victories if you don't have the power to enforce them.
Because you've got Brandy Board, you've got Cooper v. Aaron. Important rulings, symbolically, but on their own. They couldn't actually desegregate schools.
Exactly. They needed something more. And finally, you have these social historians. They're all about the human side of things, the lived experiences.
Yeah.
Especially those of the Little Rock Nine and the Black community that supported them.
Right, because these weren't just legal concepts being debated in a courtroom. These were real kids, real families. Their lives were turned upside down.
And they faced incredible hardship and danger. Just for trying to exercise their basic right to an equal education, their courage. I mean, it's inspiring.
It really makes you think about the human cost of all this. You mentioned the lost year earlier, when Faubus closed those high schools. A whole year of education lost because of segregation.
And it wasn't just the academics, it was the social and emotional impacts, their lives disrupted, the missed opportunities, the fear. It's a reminder that the fight for equality, it's about real people, real lives. And that fight didn't end when Central High was integrated.
It took until 1972 for Little Rock to become fully integrated. Think about that. 15 years after the Little Rock Nine first walked through those doors.
It shows how deep segregation ran, how much resistance there was to change. Even after these huge legal victories, progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it goes forward, sometimes it goes back.
But those 9 students, they just kept showing up. Day after day, year after year, that takes a lot of courage.
It really does. And their perseverance. Along with the work of all those activists and community members, it helped dismantle segregation in Little Rock. And it paved the way for progress in other parts of the country.
So we've talked about the historical context, the legal battles, the media coverage, the different ways historians view it. But what does this all mean for us today? What can we learn from something that happened over 60 years ago?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways for me is that real change, it takes more than just laws. It takes a shift in public opinion. It takes people who are willing to stand up to injustice.
And people who are willing to hold those in power accountable. Progress doesn't just happen on its own. It takes work. It takes pushing back against the status quo. We see that very clearly in Little Rock.
Absolutely. And remember all those images we talked about, the ones that came out of Little Rock, they really changed how people viewed segregation. It made it real. It made it personal.
It's like they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And, you know, sometimes it's not just what happened, it's how it's presented.
Right. The power of media. For better or worse, it shapes how we see the world.
Which means we need to be smart about how we consume information, question what we're seeing and hearing, get different perspectives, because media can be used to manipulate, just as easily as it can be used to expose the truth.
It's a powerful tool, and Little Rock shows us both sides of that.
So yeah, Little Rock wasn't just a school story, it's a story about power, about resistance, about the long fight for equality.
And it's a story that continues to this day.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but like with anything in history, there's always more to uncover, more to learn. It makes you think, are there other Little Rocks out there? Other things that seemed small at the time, but ended up having this huge impact.
Oh yeah, history is full of them. Things that sparked big movements. And like we've been talking about, how those things get covered by the media. It makes a difference. Who's telling the story? Whose voices are we hearing?
It's like history isn't just something in the past, it's still happening.
Right. And Little Rock really shows us that. It makes us think about how social change happens, the role of individual people, how activism can make a difference.
This deep dive has really made me think. We started with school integration, but then it became about so much more. Media, politics, the power of images.
It shows that even when things are really tough, change is possible. When people come together and say, enough is enough.
It's inspiring.
It is. And, we've only scratched the surface here.
There's always more to learn. What stood out to you? What are you thinking about after this deep dive? We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your questions. This is just the start of the conversation. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.